Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Dead End Street.
We were over the moon when we finally closed on the house. It was a charming, old Victorian with a wraparound porch, nestled in a seemingly idyllic neighborhood in a quiet part of Salem, Massachusetts. After the chaos of moving, my partner and I were eager to settle into our new life and put the stress of the last few months behind us. From the moment we arrived, the street looked like something out of a storybook. Tall trees lined the road, and the houses were quaint and well-maintained. It seemed like the perfect place to start anew. But as we began to unpack, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Every house on the street was empty, and the silence was almost oppressive. It was a stark contrast to the busy city life we'd left behind. The few neighbors we did see were peculiar, to say the least. They had shifty eyes and evasive answers, and conversations with them quickly turned awkward, as if they were trying to avoid discussing anything substantial. At first, I chalked it up to the usual new neighbor jitters. It was probably just me being overly sensitive after the stressful move. But the emptiness of the street and the odd behavior of the few residents began to gnaw at me. The quiet, once serene, now felt oppressive. Despite the growing unease, we decided to focus on the positives and give our new beginning a fair chance. After all, it was supposed to be our fresh start, and we were determined to make it work. The first week in the new house felt like an endless cascade of unsettling experiences. What began as a vague sense of discomfort soon escalated into a series of disturbing occurrences. We noticed small things at first: the lights flickering at odd hours, a distant sound of children laughing when there were no children in sight, and unsettling shadows moving just beyond our windows. Each of these incidents chipped away at our sense of normalcy. The neighbors' behavior grew increasingly bizarre. They avoided eye contact and spoke in hushed tones, as if they were constantly trying to keep something hidden. We often saw them huddled in small, secretive groups, their conversations falling silent whenever we approached. The more we observed, the more it seemed as though they were trying to shield something from us. One night, while I was up in the attic trying to make sense of the mountain of boxes still to be unpacked, I came across a dusty, old box tucked away in a corner. Curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully pried it open. Inside were old family photos, their edges yellowed with age. As I sifted through the pictures, I was struck by a particular photograph. It depicted a family that looked eerily similar to our neighbors. The background was unmistakably our street. My heart raced as I realized that everyone in these photos seemed to be missing. The stark realization hit me hard, sending a chill down my spine. Why did these people look so much like our neighbors, and why did they seem to have vanished without a trace? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a dark puzzle piece falling into place. I knew I had to confront this head-on, but the fear of what I might uncover kept me from acting on it immediately. The eerie silence of the street and the peculiar behavior of the neighbors began to feel like a sinister game I was unwillingly part of. Curiosity soon gave way to sheer dread as we delved deeper into the history of our street. We began poring over old newspapers and historical records, hoping to make sense of the eerie atmosphere that had settled over our new home. What we uncovered was both shocking and disturbing. The old articles painted a chilling picture. Several families had lived on our street over the years, and each had vanished under mysterious circumstances. There were no explanations, no signs of struggle or foul play, just abrupt disappearances, as if they had been swallowed by the ground itself. The more we read, the more the sense of foreboding grew. Determined to get some answers, we decided to approach a few neighbors. We hoped that, despite their odd behavior, they might be able to shed some light on the unsettling pattern we had discovered. However, their reactions were chillingly uniform. Whenever we broached the subject, their demeanor changed. Some would abruptly change the subject, as if the topic was too dangerous to discuss. Others grew uncomfortably silent, their eyes darting around as if expecting someone to overhear. The most unsettling encounter was with an elderly woman who seemed particularly nervous. When we asked her about the history of the street, she glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. "The cycle," she muttered, her voice trembling. "It always comes around." Before we could ask more, she shooed us away with a frantic wave of her hand, clearly eager to end the conversation. Her cryptic words only added to the growing sense of dread. The idea of a recurring cycle of disappearances was deeply unsettling. It was as if there was an unseen force controlling the fate of everyone who lived here, a force we were now unwittingly entangled with. As the days passed, the fear that had initially been a vague sense of discomfort became a gnawing terror. Every creak of the house, every odd glance from a neighbor, felt like part of a sinister plan unfolding. The realization that we were potentially next in a line of vanished residents was a weight I couldn't shake. The more we tried to uncover the truth, the more we felt like we were being watched and manipulated by forces beyond our understanding. The situation escalated rapidly as we began receiving strange, anonymous notes slipped under our door. The first one read, "Leave while you still can," and another followed with a chilling directive, "The cycle must be completed." The notes were unnervingly cryptic and seemed to amplify our growing sense of dread. It felt as though we were trapped in a sinister game, with each note adding another layer to our mounting anxiety. One sleepless night, the tension reached a breaking point. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard an unsettling scratching noise coming from the attic. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. But the noise persisted, and the scratching grew more insistent. Armed with a flashlight and a surge of nervous determination, I decided to investigate. The attic was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the rafters and old furniture draped in dusty sheets. I shone the flashlight around, trying to find the source of the sound. Behind a dusty box of old family photos, I discovered an old journal hidden in the corner. The journal was leather-bound, its cover cracked with age. I felt a shiver of unease as I opened it and began to read. The entries inside were written in a hurried scrawl, detailing the disturbing experiences of a former resident. They spoke of unexplainable sounds echoing through the house, shadows moving just beyond their vision, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The last entry, written in frantic ink, was a desperate plea for help. It read, "The street itself is alive. It controls everything. Get out before it's too late." As I read those words, a chill ran down my spine. The notion that the street itself might be alive, controlling the fate of its residents, was both terrifying and absurd. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to fit with the strange events and eerie atmosphere we had been experiencing. The house, the notes, the disappearing neighbors, it all felt interconnected, like pieces of a dark puzzle that were slowly coming together. With each new revelation, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. We were no longer just dealing with odd occurrences. We were facing a malevolent force that seemed to have a life of its own. The journal's warning felt like a final, desperate cry for help from someone who had been trapped in the same nightmare we were now living. Desperation drove us to seek out a local historian known for her research into the area's eerie history. We hoped she might shed some light on the disturbing events we had been experiencing. When we met her, her eyes widened with recognition as we described the street and the unsettling phenomena. She revealed a horrifying truth that turned our blood cold. Our street had been built over an old burial ground. The historian explained that the land was cursed, bound by an ancient malevolent entity. The disappearances weren't random. They were sacrifices intended to keep this entity bound to the street, preventing it from wreaking havoc elsewhere. The chilling revelation made our skin crawl as we realized that the street itself was the source of the evil that had haunted us since our arrival. As night fell, the oppressive atmosphere on the street became unbearable. Shadows seemed to move with a sinister intent, and the air grew thick and suffocating. The whispers of the entity grew louder, a cacophony of malevolent voices that seemed to echo from every corner. It felt as though the very ground beneath us was alive and closing in, trapping us within its grasp. Panic set in as we decided to flee. We raced towards the end of the street, but it felt like the road was shifting and changing, twisting our sense of direction. The once quiet houses now seemed to leer at us with hungry, vacant eyes. The entity's presence was palpable, a suffocating force that seemed to mock our every attempt to escape. In a desperate bid for freedom, we finally burst through the street's end just before dawn. We left everything behind: the house, our belongings, and the nightmarish street. As we looked back, the street stood silent and empty once again, as if nothing had ever happened. We never returned to that place, leaving it forever shrouded in its dark mystery. I'm sharing this story now as a warning. If you ever find yourself moving to a quiet, seemingly perfect neighborhood, remember that sometimes silence can be the loudest cry for help. And in those moments, when the quiet feels almost too perfect, it might be hiding something far more sinister than you could ever imagine.
the alarm that wouldn't stop.
I thought it was just a fluke when the fire alarm first went off in the middle of the night. My wife and I had just moved into our new home in a quiet suburb of Seattle, eager for a fresh start. The sound startled us from our sleep, but we quickly chalked it up to a minor issue, perhaps a faulty alarm or a glitch in the system. We reassured ourselves that it was nothing to worry about and went back to bed. The next night, however, the alarm went off again, and this time it felt less like a random event and more like an unwelcome guest. We immediately checked all the detectors, replaced the batteries, and even splurged on a couple of new units to ensure everything was in order. Still, despite our best efforts, the alarm persisted, blaring at the same time every night. The repetitive beeping was more than just a nuisance, it was starting to fray our nerves. The real kicker was the timing. It wasn't just random, it was precisely at 2:30 a.m. It was as if the alarm had a mind of its own, set on a clockwork schedule that we couldn't decipher. No matter what we tried, the alarm would sound exactly on the dot, like a cruel ritual we were forced to endure. This eerie precision made it impossible for us to dismiss it as mere coincidence. We tried everything we could think of to stop it. We checked for electrical issues, recalibrated the detectors, and even consulted the manufacturer for possible defects. Every time we thought we had resolved the problem, the alarm would go off again, mocking our efforts with its relentless ringing. The sound became a nightly ritual, one that chipped away at our patience and sanity. As the days turned into weeks, the constant disruption began to wear on us. The once comforting new house now felt like a prison, and the nightly alarm only deepened our growing sense of dread. We were losing sleep and growing increasingly anxious, unable to find a reasonable explanation for the relentless noise that invaded our nights. It wasn't just about the inconvenience anymore. There was something unsettling about the way the alarm went off with such regularity. It felt almost deliberate, as though it was trying to tell us something, or perhaps warn us of something we couldn't yet understand. We couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a malfunction, and as we struggled to cope, a deep sense of foreboding began to settle over us. By the second week, the alarm had become more than just a nuisance. It had turned into an obsession. Each night, I would set my watch to 2:30 a.m., the time when the piercing sound would inevitably cut through our sleep. It was like clockwork, and I found myself dreading the exact moment when the relentless beeping would start. I couldn't escape it, and it was driving me to the edge. We became consumed with trying to understand the source of the disturbance. My wife and I spent countless hours scouring every corner of the house, searching for any possible source of interference. We examined the wiring, checked for any environmental factors, and even considered that maybe there was a problem with the house's electrical system. But despite our thorough investigations, nothing seemed to explain the nightly racket. Our frustration grew with each passing night. We felt like we were stuck in a nightmarish loop, unable to break free from the relentless interruption. Desperate for a solution, we brought in a technician who performed a detailed inspection of the alarms and the electrical systems. He assured us that everything was functioning correctly and that there were no faults in the system. His confidence did little to comfort us, as the alarm continued its nightly performance without fail. The technician's assurances did little to alleviate our growing sense of unease. We started to feel like prisoners in our own home, held captive by a sound that seemed to taunt us with its regularity. Every night, we were forced to endure the cacophony, and it became increasingly clear that we were no closer to finding an explanation or a solution. We tried to distract ourselves from the constant noise by engaging in other activities during the day, hoping that it would somehow make the nights more bearable. But no matter how hard we tried, the anticipation of the alarm's piercing wail would overshadow everything else. Our sleep was fractured, and our lives began to revolve around the nightly ritual of the alarm. As the nights wore on, the alarm took on a sinister quality. It wasn't just an annoyance anymore, it felt like an insidious presence in our lives. Each night, as the clock struck 2:30 a.m. and the alarm blared, we couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to communicate something, or perhaps warn us of something terrible lurking just beyond our understanding. The more we tried to escape its grasp, the more we felt trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. Determined to uncover the cause of the relentless noise, I decided to dig into the history of our house. My curiosity led me to local archives and old newspaper clippings, where I hoped to find a clue that might explain the eerie persistence of the alarm. What I found, however, was far more disturbing than I had anticipated. The house had been the site of a tragic fire years before, a blaze that had claimed the lives of the previous occupants. According to the reports, The original fire alarm system had failed during the disaster, leaving the family inside with no way to escape the inferno. It was a horrific incident, and the sense of loss and tragedy that accompanied it was palpable even through the dusty old pages I was reading. The more I delved into the history, the more I uncovered about the tragic events that had unfolded within these walls. The fire had been devastating, and the failure of the alarm system was a crucial factor in the fatalities. The articles detailed the horror of the night, the smoke, the flames, and the desperate attempts of the family to save themselves, only to be thwarted by the malfunctioning alarms. As I absorbed the details of this heart-wrenching event, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the alarm's nightly cries were more than just a random malfunction. It felt like they were somehow connected to the tragedy that had occurred here years ago. The timing of the alarm, always at exactly 2:30 a.m., seemed almost too precise to be a coincidence. It was as if the alarm was trying to communicate something from the past, a remnant of the fire's anguish still echoing through the walls. The realization hit me hard. I began to see the alarm's nightly cries not just as an annoyance, but as a chilling reminder of the past. It was as though the house itself was trying to convey a warning, to ensure that the tragedy was never forgotten. I couldn't escape the growing sense that we were not just dealing with a faulty system, but with something far more sinister. This newfound knowledge only deepened my anxiety. The idea that the alarm was tied to a past tragedy made every nightly blare feel like a haunting echo from the past, a desperate cry for help from those who had suffered before us. The house's history was now interwoven with our own, and I couldn't ignore the growing dread that something terrible was lurking, waiting to repeat the horrors of that fateful night. As the weeks went by, the alarm's nightly symphony grew more menacing. What once was an irritating disruption now felt like a harbinger of something sinister. We began to notice other unsettling occurrences that deepened our sense of dread. Cold spots started appearing in certain rooms, inexplicable drops in temperature that made our breaths visible. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of our eyes, fleeting and elusive, always disappearing when we turned our heads. The most disturbing change was the oppressive feeling that settled over the house as the clock approached 2:30 a.m. It was as though the air itself grew heavier, more suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around us. Every night, we would brace ourselves for the inevitable alarm, but it had become more than just an annoying sound. It felt like a signal, a cue for something far more malevolent. One night, as the alarm blared and the house was bathed in the harsh, blaring light of the emergency beacon, I felt a chilling presence unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a cold, creeping sensation that crawled up my spine, leaving me paralyzed with fear. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the house itself was alive, reacting to the same time every night when the alarm went off. The sensation was so intense that it seemed as though the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with a life of their own. My wife and I were on edge, unable to sleep, dreading the sound that had become a harbinger of something we couldn't understand. Each night, as the clock inched closer to 2:30 a.m., we would clutch each other, trying to find solace in the presence of one another, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to feel safe in our own home. The alarm had stopped being just a noise. It was a signal that something terrible was coming. We tried to ignore the growing terror, but it was impossible to escape the overwhelming sense that we were being watched, that the house was somehow aware of our fear and was feeding off it. The once comforting space now felt like a trap, a place where our worst nightmares were taking shape. We couldn't escape the feeling that we were entangled in something far beyond our control, something ancient and malevolent. As each night passed, our desperation grew. The house seemed to mock our attempts to understand or escape the terror. Every time the alarm rang, it was like a cruel reminder that we were caught in a cycle with no end in sight, and whatever malevolent force was behind it was growing stronger with every passing day. Our last-ditch effort to understand the alarm's purpose led us to local historians and fire safety experts. We hoped they could offer some explanation or practical solution, but what they revealed was far more unsettling than we had imagined. The experts confirmed that the alarm was intricately connected to the house's tragic past. The original fire alarm system had been sabotaged years ago, and it was believed that the spirits of those who perished in the fire were trapped in the house, unable to find peace. The climax of our nightmare arrived one fateful night with a ferocity that we had never experienced before. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the alarm blared with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The piercing sound was accompanied by a suffocating darkness that filled every room, as if the house itself had become a living entity, swallowing all light and hope. It was as if the walls were closing in on us, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. In our frantic scramble to escape, it became horrifyingly clear that the alarm was not just a malfunctioning device, it was a warning system. It felt like a desperate, anguished plea from the spirits trapped within, urging us to leave before the tragedy of the past repeated itself. The alarm's blaring was no longer just noise, it was a haunting message from beyond, signaling that our time was running out. We fled the house in sheer terror, never looking back. The nightmarish cry of the alarm echoed in our minds as we drove away, each sound reverberating with the memory of the suffocating darkness and the oppressive fear that had gripped us. The streets of our neighborhood looked eerily calm in contrast to the chaos we had just escaped, but we knew better than to let our guard down. As we left the neighborhood behind, a chilling realization set in. Our experience served as a grim reminder that when something as innocuous as a fire alarm transforms into a nightly terror, it may be trying to warn you of something far more sinister. The past, with its unresolved anguish, has a way of reaching out, trying to protect those who might be the next victims. Sometimes, the most innocuous things hold the darkest secrets, and history has a way of repeating itself if we don't heed the warnings it gives.
The invisible trustee.
I had just moved into a charming old condominium in a quiet neighborhood of Boston, eager to start fresh after a rough breakup. The decision to leave everything behind and start anew in a different city was supposed to be a relief, and in many ways, it was. The building I chose had a vintage appeal, with its creaky wooden floors and antique fixtures that gave it a sense of history. The faded wallpaper and the scent of old wood only added to its character. But what struck me most was how quiet and empty it felt. The long hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, and the silence was almost oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. As I unpacked, trying to make the space feel like home, I was jolted out of my thoughts by the sound of paper sliding across the floor. A handwritten note had been slipped under my door. It was a simple piece of stationery, yellowed at the edges, with neat, precise handwriting. The note welcomed me to the building and outlined the basic rules. No loud noises after 10 p.m., garbage should be taken out by 8 a.m., and the laundry room was available from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. It was signed simply as the superintendent, with no name or contact information. I found it odd that I hadn't met anyone in person, especially the superintendent. Usually, there would be some sort of introduction, a face to go with the name, but there was none of that here. The lack of direct contact was strange, but I shrugged it off. Maybe the superintendent was just someone who preferred to keep to themselves. I assumed I'd run into them or one of the neighbors soon enough. That first night, as I was trying to settle into my new surroundings, something strange happened. I was woken in the middle of the night by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. The building had felt so empty during the day that hearing someone walking around was unnerving. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing. I waited, hoping they would fade away, but they didn't. Instead, they stopped right outside my door. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. There was nothing, no more footsteps, no voices, just silence. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the door, peeking out into the hallway. It was empty, the dim lights casting long shadows along the walls. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the unease, before closing the door and locking it behind me. The next morning, I decided to ask one of my neighbors about the superintendent. I ran into an older woman as she was leaving her apartment down the hall. She seemed friendly enough, so I introduced myself and mentioned the note. Her expression changed, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place crossing her face before she smiled politely. "Oh, the superintendent. You don't see him much," she said, her voice a bit too casual. "He mostly communicates through notes. Been that way for years. I wouldn't worry about it." Her answer was vague, and it left me with more questions than before. But she seemed reluctant to say more, so I thanked her and let it go. As I walked back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I tried to push those thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was just my imagination running wild after a stressful move. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, the notes kept coming. At first, they were simple reminders, almost helpful in a way, like something a concerned friend might leave. "Lock your windows at night," one note read. "Avoid using the laundry room after dark," said another. But as they continued to appear, their tone shifted from friendly reminders to something more unsettling. The specificity of the instructions began to gnaw at me. Always make sure your front door is bolted shut, one demanded. Another simply stated, do not leave your apartment after midnight. It felt like someone was watching me, observing my every move. The thought made my skin crawl. The notes weren't just generic safety tips, they were precise, almost as if the person writing them knew exactly what I was doing at all times. I started feeling paranoid, glancing over my shoulder whenever I left my apartment, expecting to catch someone spying on me. But there was never anyone there. As the days went by, the strangeness escalated. It started with small things, the lights in my apartment flickering for no apparent reason, doors creaking open on their own, and cold drafts that appeared out of nowhere, even in rooms with no windows open. At first, I tried to rationalize it. The building was old, after all, and old buildings had quirks. But it wasn't long before these occurrences became harder to dismiss. One evening, I was sitting in the living room when the temperature suddenly dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Before I could react, a note slid under the door. My heart raced as I picked it up, half expecting it to contain some kind of ominous message. Instead, it simply read, "Stay calm. Do not investigate." My hands trembled as I set the note down. How could they have known? Who was watching me? The idea that someone was tracking my every movement sent a wave of panic through me. I wanted to ignore the instructions, to throw open the door and demand answers from whoever was doing this. But something inside me, some deep, primal fear, held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, I would regret it. Determined to get some answers, I decided to speak with my neighbor again. I found her in the hallway, fumbling with her keys, and approached her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you been getting these notes too?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my nerves were on edge. She glanced at me, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously down the hall. "You should follow them," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "Just do what they say." "But why? Who's leaving them? And why do they know so much about what I'm doing?" My questions tumbled out, one after the other, the frustration and fear finally breaking through. She hesitated, then sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of whatever she was carrying was too much to bear. "Look," she began, her voice trembling, "this building, it's different. The superintendent, he's not like other people. No one really knows who he is, or where he is, but he's always been here, as long as anyone can remember. The tenants who've ignored his instructions, they didn't last long. They either moved out in a hurry, or, well, they just disappeared." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Disappeared? That couldn't be real, right? It had to be some urban legend, some story passed around to scare the new tenants. But the fear in her eyes told me otherwise. She looked at me like she was trying to decide whether to say more, but then shook her head and turned away. "Just follow the notes," she said over her shoulder as she walked away, leaving me standing there, more terrified than ever. I retreated to my apartment, locking the door behind me, my mind racing. I was trapped between two fears, the fear of what might happen if I followed the notes, and the fear of what might happen if I didn't. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, who, or what, was really in control here? After my conversation with the neighbor, I was on edge, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this building. The notes continued to arrive, each one more unsettling than the last. "Do not answer the door after 10 p.m., one warned. Another instructed, "If you hear knocking in the walls, do not respond." I started to feel like I was living in a nightmare, where the rules were designed to keep me alive, but I didn't know what I was being protected from. The atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier with each passing day. The cold drafts became more frequent, and the flickering lights seemed to follow me from room to room. I tried to go about my daily routine, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the television on at all hours just to drown out the silence, but even then, I couldn't relax. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It started as a faint tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on the walls. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The tapping was coming from inside the wall, right next to my bed. I froze, remembering the note that warned me not to respond to any knocking in the walls. My instinct was to get up and check it out, to find the source of the noise, but the fear that had been building inside me held me back. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, hoping that whatever was making the sound would go away if I ignored it. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity. It grew more frantic, as if whatever was on the other side of the wall was desperate to get my attention. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But the sound was real, and it was getting louder. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and oppressive. I didn't dare move, too terrified to even open my eyes. The only sound was the rapid beating of my heart in my ears. I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to do anything but listen to the silence. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, it was still dark outside. I glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed a new note on the nightstand, one that definitely wasn't there before I fell asleep. My hands shook as I picked it up, dread pooling in my stomach. The note was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. "You did well. Do not ignore the next one." I dropped the note, my mind racing. How had it gotten there? Who was doing this to me? And what did they mean by the next one? I felt trapped, like a puppet being controlled by some unseen force. I wanted to run, to leave the building and never look back, but something told me it wouldn't be that easy. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being prepared for something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. The notes, the disturbances, the warnings, they were all leading to something. And whatever it was coming soon. The next morning, I didn't leave my apartment. I couldn't bring myself to face the world outside, not when the one inside was crumbling around me. I sat on the couch, staring at the walls, waiting for the next sign, the next instruction. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something dark and dangerous, something I couldn't escape. And then, as if on cue, there was a knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat as I glanced at the clock. It was exactly 10:01 p.m. The night after the knock, things took a darker turn. It felt as though the entire building was closing in on me. The quiet whispers that had once been almost imperceptible now filled the room every night, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out, but they carried a tone of warning, or maybe even menace. They sounded close, too close, as if someone, or something, was right beside me, whispering in my ear. I started finding my belongings in places I hadn't left them. My keys, usually hung by the door, would turn up on the kitchen counter, my shoes by the bed when I was certain I had left them in the hallway. One morning, I woke up to find all the chairs in my living room turned to face the windows, perfectly aligned. I hadn't touched them, but it was the message on the bathroom mirror that finally broke me. I had just finished a long, scalding shower, hoping the heat would wash away some of the fear that clung to me. But when I stepped out and wiped the fogged-up mirror, there it was, "Stop digging," scrawled in the remaining condensation. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I hadn't written it, and the thought that someone had been in my apartment, touching my things, scrawling messages on my mirror, sent a wave of panic through me. Shaking, I rushed out of the bathroom and went straight to my neighbor's door. I pounded on it, desperate for answers. She opened it, her face pale, eyes wide with fear when she saw me. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "I know you know something. You need to tell me what's happening." She hesitated, looking over her shoulder nervously before finally letting out a long sigh. "I tried to dig too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I tried to figure out who he was, why he was doing this. But he doesn't like it when we get too close to the truth. The superintendent, he's not just a man. He's something else now. His spirit is tied to this place, and he won't let go. He protects this building, but it's twisted, his protection." Her words hung in the air, heavy with dread. I wanted to dismiss her as crazy, but everything I had experienced made it impossible to do so. "And the notes? The warnings?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper now. "They're his way of keeping control," she said, her eyes filled with something between fear and resignation. "If you follow the rules, you stay safe. But if you don't, you become his next target. I don't know what happens after that, and I don't want to find out." I left her standing in the hallway, my mind racing. If what she said was true, I was in more danger than I had ever realized. I could feel the weight of the building pressing down on me, as if it were alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make a wrong move. That night, the final note came. Slipped under my door like all the others, but this one was different. The paper was crumpled, the handwriting more frantic, almost angry. Leave now, or face the consequences. My hands trembled as I read it, and before I could even process the words, the lights in my apartment began to flicker violently. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence, something dark and oppressive, lurking just out of sight. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a command. I was no longer welcome here. I stood in the middle of the room, the note clenched in my hand, as the lights flickered off and on, casting the room in alternating shadows and harsh light. The whispering voices grew louder, and I could feel someone, standing right behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew I had pushed too far. I had to leave, and I had to leave now. I grabbed what I could, my keys, my phone, a jacket, and rushed to the door. I didn't look back as I bolted out of the apartment, down the hallway, and out of the building. The air outside was cold, but it felt freeing, no longer suffocating like the air inside. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, the building a distant silhouette behind me. I was safe for now, but the lingering feeling of being watched never left me. I knew I could never go back to that apartment, not after everything that had happened. The superintendent, whatever he was, had made sure of that. The terror had reached a crescendo, and I was suffocating under its weight. What was supposed to be a fresh start had devolved into a waking nightmare. The apartment that had once seemed like a sanctuary was now a cage. Every attempt to leave felt thwarted by an invisible force, a malevolent presence that kept me tethered to that place. The footsteps outside my door grew more insistent, as if someone, or something, was pacing, waiting for me to make a mistake. The constant paranoia gnawed at me, leaving me on edge and exhausted. I couldn't stay here a moment longer. I knew I had to get out, no matter the cost. I made a plan and decided that tonight was the night I would escape. I began packing my essentials, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I stuffed clothes and personal items into my bag. The thought of leaving everything behind was painful, but it was the only way to ensure my survival. As I zipped up the last bag and moved toward the door, a sudden chill swept through the apartment. The lights flickered once more, then went out completely, plunging me into a suffocating darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. A voice, barely more than a whisper, slid through the blackness like a razor. "You were warned." I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was nothing but shadows. The oppressive darkness seemed to press in on me, making it difficult to breathe. My panic surged, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. When I finally turned on the light, the beam cut through the darkness, but the sense of dread remained. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out while I still could. I grabbed my bag and yanked open the door, racing down the hallway with the hope that I would find freedom. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, mingling with the distant, unsettling whispers that seemed to follow me. When I reached the building's exit, I threw open the door and burst into the night air. I didn't stop to look back. My heart was racing, and the adrenaline made me feel both alive and numb. I stumbled to a nearby street and flagged down a cab, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as I watched the building recede into the distance. I stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to recover from the ordeal. In between fits of sleep and endless cups of coffee, I began researching the history of the building. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Several former residents had disappeared under mysterious circumstances after ignoring the superintendent's warnings. The records were sparse, but the pattern was clear. Those who defied the rules faced a grim fate. I don't know what the superintendent truly was or why he haunted that building, but the evidence was undeniable. The notes, the warnings, the terror, it was all part of a cruel game designed to keep people in line, or worse, to keep them from leaving. I'm sharing my story now as a warning to anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. If you ever receive a note from someone you can't see, if the warnings seem excessive or strange, take them seriously. There might not be a second chance to escape whatever unseen force is lurking behind the messages. As for me, I've moved on, but the memories of that apartment and the chilling whispers in the dark will stay with me forever.